Thank you everyone for coming today for today's program. My name is Lila Anderson. I'm the Curator of Education for University Museums. I'm here in the Farmhouse Museum today. Before we get started, I have a few announcements. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Kathy and John Howell Art Enrichment Program for their support of this program. Second, just a few housekeeping things. During the presentation, we ask that you keep your sound and your video off. At the end, we will have some time for questions, and at that point, you are welcome to turn on your audio to ask a question. You can also use the chat feature, which you see on the side of your screen. Lastly, I do encourage you to come and see the exhibition that inspired us to host this talk, Flicker and Flame, Whale Oil and Kerosene Lamps at the Farmhouse Museum at Iowa State. It's on display Monday through Friday, 12 to 4, all the way until October 29th. We also encourage you to look at other programs that we have at the museums. And if you're in New England, you can go to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, where our speaker today is from. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you Michael Dyer. He's the Senior Maritime Historian at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in American History from York College of Pennsylvania and a Master of Arts in American Studies from Penn State Harrisburg. He studied at Mystic Seaport and was the inaugural USA Gallery Fellow at the Australian National Maritime Museum in 2008. From 1993 to 2001, he was the Curator of Maritime History and librarian at the Kendall Whaling Museum in Sharon, Massachusetts. His interest in whalemen's original art began at the KWM, but he has contributed to many scholarly articles, to periodical publications, is a frequent public speaker, and over the years has crafted several exhibitions on American and world whaling history, maritime decorative arts, and cartography. Or the Wide and Trackless Sea, Original Art of the Yankee Whale Hunt is his first book. So we're really excited to have Michael here today. With a little help from technology, he can be with us all the way from New Bedford, Massachusetts. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to him. So give me a second here. I'll spotlight you, Michael.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Thank you very much, Lila. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be here. It's nice to be talking to folks in the heartland. It's really kind of neat to have gotten the invitation to talk about this exhibit. We were talking earlier in the waiting room about the penetration of whale products into the heartland of the U.S. We were talking a little bit about the steamboat that was uncovered in the field in Iowa, and it had boxes of spermaceti candles on board, and this whole idea of the retail sale of whale products that came from really a restricted highly constricted set of seaports on the East Coast, provided whale products for all of the U.S. at the time in the mid 19th century, and also ports in Europe. But we'll be talking about that today. So we'll get started with the PowerPoint here. I don't want to disappoint anybody if you were coming to be connoisseurs of lamps. I only have a few images of sperm oil lamps with sperm oil in them, but for the most part, the talk today is going to cover the history of the products and the markets of commercial whaling. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end. So here we go. Okay, so let's see, where were we? We were talking about sperm whales and bowhead whales. And the lady in the upper left-hand corner is probably of great interest to you with her candlesticks, spermaceti candlesticks, and spermaceti candles, and her lighting. And we've got umbrellas down here, which has nothing to do with oil. It has everything to do with baleen from the bowhead whale. There's oil, there's fertilizer, There's unguents, of various kinds, cosmetics and ambergris, and very, very importantly, lighthouses. So one of the great uses of sperm oil was in the lighthouse trade. Of course, from time immemorial, Europeans knew about sperm whales. Sperm whales would periodically strand on the coasts of Holland and the Netherlands, and also England and elsewhere in Western Europe. And people knew about sperm whales, as in this 1650 oil painting by Adam Villiers. It was a great event, when a sperm whale would wash ashore. So people knew about them, and they chopped into the head and they got oil out of them, and they took various measurements of the animals and whatnot, but they never really developed any kind of a commercial whale fishery for sperm whales, which are deep ocean animals. Rather, the Europeans, the Dutch and the British, in the early part of the 17th century, began explorations looking for a northeast passage to China across the top of Siberia. And in these voyages, they discovered great shoals of whales around the islands in the Arctic, and began pursuing an Arctic whale fishery. So this painting by Adam Villiers, by Klaus von Willingen from 1620, shows everything that you need, that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit, about shore whaling. So they've got, you've got your whales, you've got your 6 guys in a double-ended boat. You tow your whales back to shore. You chop them up, put them in tripods, and boil out the oil. So it's like if you took a big Dutch oven and put it on your stove, and turned up the heat, and took all the bacon in your house and your neighbor's house and your neighbor's house down the road, and put it all in the Dutch oven and cooked it all down into oil, and then got rid of the bacon and kept the oil. That's essentially the process, except you're doing it with whale blubber, which was a product that had great commercial value. So much so that even some of the early cartography of the Arctic went so far as to actually include vignettes of shore whaling around the Arctic region. So you see the ships, you see the whales, you see that the oil's being boiled out here in big cauldrons. You see the whales being towed back to the camps. These were seasonal camps over the summer months, and that story is the story of Arctic exploration, and how it really began, and how it developed over time. It was a commercial whaling exploration of that region that led to that really led to the creation of these products. Let's see. I'd like to. Yeah. Okay. So I'm still here. The fishery progressed westward toward Greenland, and the fleets got very large. The British fleet didn't succeed because of the managerial structure of the British whale fishery, but the Dutch fleet was privatized. So private merchants owned and managed the vessels, and their fishery grew tremendously. So much so that these kinds of cookeries and soap manufacturing facilities and shipbuilding facilities grew up in urban centers in the Netherlands. And you can see, in the back, there's a church back here, there's a steeple back here. This watercolor painting is from Rotterdam, and it which became an industrial center, one of the earliest sort of urban industrial centers to handle all the shipping of the whale fishery, the shipping of the Dutch East India Company, the manufacture of whale products, the manufacture of soap in particular was a big one, and oil for street lighting and lubrication. I'm not exactly jumping forward, because if you remember, this painting dates from 1620. The Pilgrims landed here at Plymouth in 1620. Over the next 40 years, colonists in New England discovered that there were whale species that migrated up along the coast, along Long Island, out around Nantucket, out along Cape Cod, and would spend February, March, and April in the waters around Cape Cod Bay. And so a shore fishery developed here in Wellfleet and over here on Long Island. And these targeted the Eubelina glacialis, what we commonly call today the right whale. And this was the black whale of the Americans. This was the migratory species that was targeted by colonists at first for oil and baleen, just like the Dutch and the English in the Arctic had chased bowhead whales and continued to chase bowhead whales this whole time. But significantly, Americans pushed out into the open ocean to hunt sperm whales. I gotta, I have to point out, that part of the reason that this developed in this particular region had to do with geography, but it also had to do with society. Many of the earliest American whalers were Quakers, Quaker Protestants, who did not at all get along with the Puritans of Boston. And the Puritans of Boston, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were the people who were in charge and sort of pushed Quakers to the margins of the colony. Quakers were welcome in Newport, Rhode Island, and moved into this region and began small-scale farming and maritime trades, shipbuilding, and whale hunting. Now, shore whaling in New England differed very little from the earliest shore whaling that we saw, up in Spitsbergen and Jan Mayen Island and places like that. As a matter of fact, there are no illustrations of colonial whaling really at all, and certainly no illustrations of the early shore whaling. However, this print, let's see, this print was from the middle part of the 17th century, and it showed all of the apparatus that's necessary to hunt whales from shore and to cut them up into pieces like we saw earlier on and boil out the oil. So North American shore whaling would not have looked unlike this scene that we see here. This is a retrospective view that was done probably about 1850, 1855 by a New Bedford artist named William Allen Wall. And Wall was looking back and imagining what the colonial whale fishery would have looked like along the Acushnet River. Let's go back here for a second. The Acushnet River and New Bedford are right here. So this is, you got to go up Buzzards Bay and into this estuary, which is protected by the wind, and it was a deep water port, and it was very, very early recognized. Bartholomew Gosnold in 1602 recognized, that this would have been was to be a great port someday. Being an English mariner exploring the coast of New England, he pretty much knew with a professional eye that this was going to be a great place to build a seaport someday. And sure enough, that's how it turned out. This picture is really interesting because you see that there's no wharves or anything. All it is a spot along the shore where you can sail a sloop, single-masted sloop, careen the sloop on the shore, and then using oxen and blocks and tackles, get all of those casks of blubber off the sloop and into the try house and boil it all down into oil, which is what you see this fella here is pouring off the sperm oil into a cask. How do we know it's sperm oil? Well, this jaw sort of suggests that they're processing sperm whales. Also significantly, we see Native Americans and we see African Americans in the picture, which was absolutely spot on accurate for the actions of colonial whalers in this region at this time. These folks were participants in the whale fishery from the earliest days right up almost to the very end. But the really important innovation, and this is a little bit perplexing about this picture because the really important innovation was a shipboard try-works. And the shipboard try-works would eliminate this entire image. All of this work could be done at sea. And so this is a model of a shipboard try-works, which is a brick furnace with two big iron cauldrons in it. And it would be mounted amidships on a whaler. In this particular case, it's a schooner. But the sloops, like we saw earlier, schooners, sometimes brigs in the 18th century would turn into big three-masted square riggers by the 19th century as this fishery spread out around the world. So this is a shipboard. This is a model of a try-works with you boil out the oil in there. You build a fire in here and boil out all the oil, and then you take the crispy parts of the blubber and toss it into the fire and burn it, and ladle the hot oil into a copper cooler to cool. And then there was a hose that goes from the copper cooler down below decks to be stored in wooden casks. This oil, this big jug of oil, is what the trade knew in the 20th century as NW45, natural winter sperm oil. And this particular oil was found in a steel cask in a basement in Salem, Massachusetts, and it came from a grease factory in Salem that was in operation in the 1960s. And this is 100% pure, top of the line sperm oil that was produced in Massachusetts in the 1960s. So it's just, you'll see in another couple of slides that it looks almost exactly like the product that was being produced in New Bedford in the 19th century. So this is a custom house seal from the New Bedford Custom District dated about 1790. And I included it because it has this fabulous picture of a sloop. So this is a pretty early picture of Yankee whaling. And like we saw in the Veeringen painting, you got a double-ended boat with 6 guys in it. That technology itself really didn't change for hundreds of years. So this seal is a pretty neat thing. And this is where the action took place. So this map was drawn by a man named Charles Haskins Townsend, who was he was a member of the U.S. Fish and Fisheries Commission in the 1890s. By 1902, he was director of the New York Aquarium, and he produced this map and other maps very similar to it, showing the oceans of the world, wherein he plotted the exact location of whales taken on Yankee whaling voyages from logbooks. And so these whaling grounds, the Charleston ground, the Southern ground, the Hatteras ground in here, the Western ground, this was the region where the American sperm whaling began and also where it ended, which is a real irony and a very, very interesting fact to think about, that schooners from New Bedford and Nantucket would sail out into this region in the 1750s, 1760s, hunting sperm whales. And in the 1920s, schooners from New Bedford would sail out into the same region using the same boats, the same harpoons, almost the same harpoons, and continue this hunt. So this is where it all took place. Importantly, for our story today, the invention, more or less the invention of spermaceti candles happened in Newport, Rhode Island in the middle part of the 18th century, where an Englishman supposed that he had a process to create spermaceti candles. And he did, in fact, have this process. The man's name was Benjamin Crabbe, but Crabbe's process was quickly overtaken by Sephardic Jewish immigrants to Newport by Jacob Rivera and Arab Lopez. And Lopez and Rivera perfected the purification of sperm oil, the pressing of the oil into clear, out of the spermaceti, out of the nose of the sperm whale, and made clear oil out of it, but most importantly, pressed it into a hard wax that could then be made into candles. And those candles then became a colonial manufacturing product for export from the colonies. And if you think about that for a minute, that's pretty extraordinary. The colonists weren't supposed to be manufacturing stuff. They were supposed to be providing commodities to England so the English could do the manufacturing and then the colonies could buy the goods. But in the case of spermaceti candles, just the opposite happened. Because the expertise was here, and because Newport and New England were much closer to the Caribbean, which was a major market for spermaceti candles. We'll get to that in a second. These two receipts, beautifully engraved receipts, they date from 1770. These are receipts for for the sale of candles from Joseph Palmer in Boston and Nicholas Brown of Providence, Rhode Island. And you can get a sense, really of the elegance of the product from the elegance of the receipts themselves. So this is sort of one of the among the many unpleasant aspects of whaling. This is one of them, and that was that American spermaceti candles were sold to the British colonies in the Caribbean, where there were big sugar plantations, so that enslaved people could work day and night. So they didn't have to work in the dark anymore. They could now work. They could work day and night producing sugar. It's one of the realities of whaling and of history of the Americas in general, but it's also something really to think about. That one of the major markets was not the elegant parlors in London or Boston or Paris, but were the workhouses of the Caribbean, sugar plantations. So, as we talked about earlier, New Bedford on the Acushnet River, so the Acushnet River up here, grew into a really important whaling port because of the efforts of people like Lopez and Rivera, who tried to corner the market on spermaceti candles. The Quakers of Nantucket and the Dartmouth region of southeastern Massachusetts took it upon themselves to build their own whale oil and sperm oil refineries and candle works. And in 1765, Bedford Village was laid out on the west side of the Acushnet River, specifically to prosecute the whale fishery for sperm whales and black whales for whale oil for world markets. And well, actually in the colonial days, it was for markets in England. And I'm not sure whether New Bedford and Nantucket candles wound up in the Caribbean or not. I haven't actually found that documentation. The Newport candles certainly did. But at the end of the American Revolution, now Americans were free to pursue their own markets. And one of the curious facts of the American Revolution is that there were many loyalist Quakers, and they fled the colonies and they settled in Nova Scotia and in communities in Wales, and also on the coasts of France. And the port of Le Havre and the port of Dunkirk in France became really important markets for American spermaceti oil and candles. I threw this slide in because it's just kind of an interesting fact. This kind of dichotomy. This is the city seal of New Bedford, lucem diffundo, saying "I diffuse light," which is kind of a parallel statement about the Quakers and their pursuit of their understanding of coming to Christ through the inner light of the individual, which was their profound belief, and the fact that they chased sperm whales around and manufactured oil for burning in lamps and for candles for lighting. So it's an interesting fact of the seal. This "I diffuse light" is the statement that New Bedford makes for itself. But at the end of the Revolution, all of a sudden, England was cut off from this really important commodity. This was the demand for spermaceti candles and sperm oil for street lighting and domestic lighting was enormous. And as it so happens, many of these loyalist Quakers helped the British establish their own sperm whale fishery. So this illustration, which appeared in a voyage narrative from 1793, is not merely an illustration. It's a guide to how to cut up and process a sperm whale. 1793, of course, is a decade after the end of the Revolution, and the British were developing their own sperm whale fishery, and they needed information about how to do that. So, you can see that this is the head of the sperm whale where the spermaceti was. While it's in the head of the animal, it's a liquid, but once you cut into the head and it gets exposed to the air and starts to cool, it starts to solidify, which is a very important fact, because that's how you process spermaceti, is by cooling it, putting it in sacks and cooling it down, and then pressing it in great screw presses. The body blubber would be, these holes here for blubber hooks. You cut a hole in the blubber and stick a hook in it, and the rope would go up to the ship, and then you'd cut into the blubber and just peel the blubber off the animal as it was in the water. And so this was a professional process that the British needed to learn in order to pursue their own sperm whale fishery, which they did. The British sperm whale fishery grew by leaps and bounds in the 1790s, right up into the 1840s, and then it went into decline after that. But when you look into the records of the British South Sea whale fishery, you'll see captains named Gardner and Coffin and Hussey and Macy and Chase, and these Clark, Butler. These were the same sort of Quaker Nantucket names that turn up, in the American colonial whaling experience. This particular print was by William John Huggins, and it was an aquatint done in 1825. documenting the South Sea whale fishery in the Sulu Sea in the East Indies. And it predates the earliest formal American art by a good decade. But you can see that the British adapted the American style of cutting in a sperm whale, where the tail is tied up to the ship and then these strips of blubber are pulled off and hauled up on board and then cooked out in the try works. So, and how important really was the candle trade? Well, this is an invoice for 6,000 pounds of spermaceti candles that were being sold by William Roach Jr. of New Bedford to Ropes and Pickman of Boston. Ropes and Pickman of Boston were engaged in the Baltic trade, specifically with St. Petersburg, Russia. And so a lot of these candles would have been sold to Ropes and Pickman and then shipped to St. Petersburg. And this is what spermaceti actually looks like. So you can see this is in a jar in the gallery, and it's kind of crystallized, and then there's some oil underneath because the temperature of the gallery isn't really cold. If it was really cold, the whole thing would crystallize. This is a block of spermaceti wax, solid wax that has been pressed out, has been bleached with sunlight and potash, and is ready to be heated up and poured into a candle mold for candles. I think it's very, very interesting that not only do they charge $2,318 and 40 pounds dollars for this for the candles, but they also charge $50 for the boxes. So these Yankee merchants, they weren't giving anything away. So I promised that I was going to show you some lamps, and these are the lamps that we have in the collection with sperm oil in them. So we often hear about whale oil lamps, whale oil lamps. Well, whale oil comes from animals other than sperm whales. So they come from the various right whales, the bowhead, the North Atlantic black whale, the South Atlantic black whale, and the North Pacific black whale. These were all the right whales of commerce, and their oil was used for lighting, but it's pretty nasty to burn indoors. But you could burn it outdoors, and you could burn it in factories, and of course you could do all sorts of things with it, including heavy-duty lubrication and particularly importantly, soap making. But this process of making clean oil was extremely important and highly skilled. And you could see that these fellas have the head of a sperm whale on the deck of a ship, and they're bailing the spermaceti out of the head into buckets, which will then go into casks. This fella is actually boiling oil on a try-works. This photo was taken about 1920. This photo was taken about the same time. These, and you can see that this fellow working at the try-works is covered in a heavy canvas suit because this is boiling oil, and you don't want to get boiling oil on your skin. But it's being boiled out of the try-works, and there's the oil going into the copper cooler. And this is what the refined product looked like when it went to market. And we have these three lamps with their dual cotton wicks. And this one has a single cotton wick. These have two cotton wicks. And this one had two cotton wicks too. These double wicks differ, of course, from camphene or burning fluid lamps, which have the little caps that go on the two tubes that stick up. You don't want your camphene oil to evaporate, or your camphene burning fluid to evaporate. So you cover the tubes with these little caps, but the oil is not going anywhere. And these are probably from the 1840s, 1850s. maybe even as late as the 1870s, these nice glass lamps. The oil itself had to be gauged for its quality as it came off the ship. And this is one tool that the gauger would use to measure the specific gravity or the quality of the oil. This is a hydrometer. And as the oil came off, it had to be gauged. And this is a unique picture. There is no other such picture of this process at all anywhere. And you can see that, from the whaling merchant's point of view, this is really where the rubber hits the road. So this is where he finds out whether he made any money or not. He's got a gauging rod here that goes down through the bung of that cask to gauge how much oil is in it. And then they measure the head of the cask. And then the gauger does a computation where they actually compute the number of gallons of oil in one of these, in these very large casks. And this guy back here with the mallet is whacking the cask on either side of the bung so that the bung will pop out so that the oil can be pumped out and graded, tested. And the gauger is there making sure that the quality is exactly as it should be. This fellow over here is scraping all the muck that accumulates on the head of a whale oil cask over 4 years at sea to see what markings are on the cask, whether it's whale oil or spermaceti or what. So these casks would have markings on the head, and you had to scrape all the filth off of them to get to see what those markings actually were. So this is where the owner figures out whether he's made any money or not. If this is high quality sperm oil, and there's a lot of it, then things are looking pretty good if the market is good. And of course the market fluctuated. Same thing with whale oil, although it wasn't quite as important with whale oil as it was with sperm oil. In the trying out process, only clean blubber could go into these try works. If any blood or meat or debris of any kind got into those try works, it would taint the oil. It would color the oil and make it smell bad. And then when the gauger goes to examine the oil, and I'll show you here, here are some of the tools. So this is called a thief, and it's a test tube on the end of a long rod, and you dip that rod into the oil and you could lift it up and see the color of the oil. And gauge whether it's high quality or not. And here's some of that oil. This is from a 19th century New Bedford oil refinery, and it looks almost exactly like the stuff from the 20th century refinery that we saw earlier. So here's one of those gauging rods that would be dipped down inside the cask. Here's another couple. This one has a whalebone handle, and here's the gauger's notebook where he actually wrote down. Where he writes down the number of gallons in each of the casks. Here's a picture of the George Delano's Oil and Candle Factory in New Bedford, this was the largest grease oil works in the world at the time, which was about 1869. This facility could process 550,000 barrels of sperm oil annually. Most of that oil, or much of that oil, was sold to Uncle Sam for the domestic lighthouse trade. This facility is a cold storage facility where the casks would go in and be kept below 45 degrees so that the oil would and spermaceti would thicken up. And then it went through a number of boiling processes before finally being put into shallow vats in this building with the sunlight coming through these skylights. The oil would be mixed with potash, and the sunlight would bleach all the color or much of the color out of the oil, so that it got that nice straw color for the domestic market. So this is a New Bedford Oil Works, probably from about, this was between 1869 and about 1880 or so. It was built on the site of an earlier works, the Leonard Oil Works in the 1850s, which was also a major candle works and sperm oil refinery. And here you can see the cart, that would haul the casks of oil from the wharves up to the facility. And then once the oil was ready to go, it could be sold in New York. It could be sold in Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Charleston, New Orleans. That steamboat that we talked about earlier, had spermaceti candles on board, and they would have been shipped probably to New Orleans on board one of these sloops. Whaling merchants didn't just own whale ships. They owned the transport vessels as well. So this topsail schooner and this topsail sloop would have, barrels and barrels of whale oil and sperm oil and boxes of candles on board, and be heading off to market wherever that may be. And this was a constant trade that went all up and down the eastern seaboard, all day and all night, 365 days a year. It would be like standing on an overpass and watching the tractor trailers roll by, watching all of these sloops and schooners traveling the East Coast to the seaports. This is a painting of New Bedford Harbor from about 1849. Now this is an extremely rare watercolor that was done by a New Bedford artist who lived in Philadelphia. His name was Joseph Shoemaker Russell. And this is the interior of a retail oil and lamp store. And it's got a variety of lamps are for sale in the store. And then these oil dispensaries. And so you could go in and buy Liverpool lamps, and you could buy your sperm oil right from the retailer. Now, as it turns out, I was the underbidder on this picture when it went up for auction some years ago, and I never knew what happened to it. And as a result of this program and my research for this program, I was able to figure out that the Smithsonian Museum of American History bought this picture. So I feel good being the underbidder to the Smithsonian. That's very good. And it also proves that, we have good taste here. We know it's important. And as you can see, African Americans were, an integral part of the whaling trade at many, many levels, at most levels, in fact, all levels. In fact, there were Black Americans who owned whale ships and sold whale products, on an international market. This is another fabulous thing that turned up as a result of research into this program, which is it's a little broadside dated 1836 from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where the mayor is accepting proposals to buy spermaceti oil for lighting the streets in the ensuing season, from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So this is great stuff. And I would hope that there's more of this kind of thing out there in the hinterland, in Louisville, Kentucky, or Cleveland, Ohio, or, St. Louis, Missouri, or wherever there are, wherever there are cities and towns that had street lighting. If any of you are in, an archive, in the hinterland anywhere, doing your work, doing your research, or look around for this stuff, because it's an untold story. What was the retail market in the U.S. for American whale products? And it'll probably look like something like this, some kind of an advertisement or a receipt of some kind, business records. Lighthouses were huge. You know, there were lighthouses on the Great Lakes that that absorbed a lot of East Coast sperm oil and whale oil that was shipped via the Erie Canal. But this manuscript map shows a lighthouse on the Tortugas Islands in Florida from 1839, and this is a lighthouse oil delivery chart that we found in a coastal schooner logbook that came in to the museum a few years back. So this is another, one of these great pieces of evidence for the distribution of whale products and their ultimate retail uses. So here's a view of New Bedford Harbor at the height. Had a big square rigged ship outfitting in the stream, flying the house flag of Isaac Howland Jr., one of the major merchants, whale oil merchants in the U.S. at the time. And you can see it's a very busy harbor. All kinds of work going on along the waterfront, warehouses of various kinds, cooperage, blacksmith shops, pump and block makers, paint shops, all kinds of important sail makers, rigging lofts, the kinds of things that that are important to making a working seaport and a whaling port. So, the gross value of the industry has been estimated at $8 million. And that was about in the mid 1840s, sort of at the height of the overall American fleet, which is worth about $500 million today. It was one of the top 10 producing economic drivers in the American economy in the 1840s. But it couldn't last forever. And the country just outgrew the whale fishery. And, when the railroad came and the coasts were joined in 1869, whether or not oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania, petroleum, the whale fishery was done for. There was no way that the whale fishery could ever supply the needs of this gigantic new nation. But as it happened, petroleum was in fact discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. And out of petroleum came new lubricants and obviously kerosene for burning. Curiously, one of the more significant people in that story actually came from Fairhaven, right across the river from New Bedford here, Henry Huddleston Rogers. He developed a way to ship oil through pipelines, and he quickly rose in the industry until he became a vice president in the Standard Oil Company. And so, this guy came out of a whaling port, but he moved west to Pennsylvania very early on when the petroleum fields were open, and became a leader in the industry. In fact, Henry Huddleston Rogers actually donated the first museum building to the old Dartmouth Historical Society, New Bedford Whaling Museum here. If you're ever in town, look me up. I'll show you the plaque, the marble plaques that are inset in the walls of the museum that document Rogers' gift to the society. So the tank car that we know and love today grew out of the need to ship oil, petroleum from the fields, and this was a system. But Rogers, of course, developed a pipeline system that was very different. But even so, tank cars still move liquids, particularly petroleum from the oil fields, all across the railroads of the nation to the new markets. Compared to whaling, whaling is an extremely labor-intensive process where, you got to go sail out around the world for years at a time, find the whales, kill the whales, cut in the whales, boil them out, stow the oil, sail home, unload the oil, gauge the oil, figure out if it's any good, send the oil to the refinery to be processed into a usable product, and then send that product to market. So whereas petroleum, came out of the ground as liquid and was shipped directly to the refineries, and then was processed from there. So it was a much less labor intensive process than whaling was. But this guy's testing the quality of the oil coming out of this cask, and it's these are pretty wonderful images if you're interested in whaling history. Now, that's not the whole story by a long shot. The development of coal gas for public and private lighting is far more important in many ways, in many respects, even than the development of petroleum. And this is an untold part, really unexamined aspect of the lighting story was coal gas, and coal gas facilities that enabled entire cities to be lit with gas. And that means you're not using petroleum and you're not using whale oil, which was a big blow right here in New Bedford in 1850, in the mid 1850s, when the whale oil merchants were looking around saying, what are you people doing with this coal gas? You're going to put us out of business. But even the city of New Bedford, being the parsimonious Quakers that they were, figured out that, it's far more efficient to ship coal and make coal gas and light the houses and the streets of the city with this kind of product than it is the very expensive product of the whale fishery. And so here's a view. This is the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company coal pocket in New Bedford, and these are hopper cars full of coal. And over here is the New Bedford Gas and Edison power plant, producing by this time, by the 1890s, producing electricity from coal gas. Whaling itself shifted, the market shifted entirely to the Western Arctic and San Francisco for baleen from bowhead whales, to feed the women's clothing industry. Hoop skirts, corsets, and crinolines were all the rage in women's dress, and that's what drove the whale fishery for most of the latter half of the 19th century. This is all baleen from bowhead whales stacked up on the wharves in San Francisco. And it was all taken from the Western Arctic. So, women's clothes needed these spreading hoops of various kinds. They needed these tight-waisted corsets, and baleen was used to spread the skirts, to build the cages, and to strap women in nice and tight with their corsets. So here's a deceptive photograph. This was a very late in the game photograph of the New Bedford Wharves. You may see it in years to come, or you may have seen it now, used as an example of the success of Yankee whaling, when in fact it is just the opposite. This is all oil accumulating on the wharves with no market for it, and the whalers are being broken up. They're tied up along the wharves, being ready to get broken up. In the background is a big German bark that came into New Bedford carrying raw cotton for the textile mills. In New Bedford, cotton textile production took over whaling completely. And this famous photograph is actually a photo not of a successful whale fishery, but of a dying whale fishery. In the early 20th century, there was a market for sperm products. And this particular piece is a pharmaceutical piece of spermaceti that was used in the U.S. Navy to make a like a cold cream for burns. So there were markets for it, but the Yankee whale fishery was pretty much done. And instead, these markets expanded in the 20th century, but Americans weren't providing the oil. The Europeans were providing the sperm oil for the American markets in huge quantities. And these products included automatic transmission fluid, brake fluid, colored pencils, typewriter ribbons, pleated dresses, all sorts of products that used sperm oil. So that's the end of my presentation today. And let's see.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, you're welcome. I may not have covered everything that you wanted to hear, but it covered more than you really wanted to hear.
I mean, I think it was a lot of really fascinating information and beautiful, really interesting images and primary source material. So really wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's see. We're right at the kind of end of our time here. Are you able to take questions, or should I see if maybe if people have?
Yeah, I could take a couple questions. I'm sure there's people that want that have something they want to add.
So if you do want to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask, or you can use the chat to ask a question as well.
Well, okay.
I don't know. Maybe there's not a question. I had a quick question for you that's probably easy for you to answer, but in the map that you showed in the kind of early in the presentation, there was multiple different colors. Are those the different species of whales that it's referring to on that map?
Those were different times of the year that the animals were taken.
Oh, different times of the year. Okay. Because it had to do with the quality of the oil then, the season, like that they were caught in. Did that change quality at all?
No, it didn't change the quality of the oil depending on the season or the sea where the animals were caught, unless the animal was diseased or there was some problem with the animal itself.
Right.
But, mostly no. It was just to track the frequency of where animals appeared at certain times.
Right. You do have a question here from Michael Long. Are there still countries where commercial whaling is performed?
Yes, there are still in Norway and Iceland and Japan. There's still, the Norwegians eat whales, and the Japanese hunt whales more for a cultural imperative, really, than any real desire to eat whales. The market for whale meat in Japan is limited. However, the Japanese have been hunting whales for hundreds and hundreds of years and feel that they can hunt whales if they feel like it, period, end of discussion. And they're right, they can hunt whales if they feel like it, and there's nothing that anybody can do or say about it. That's the same thing with the Norwegians, who've been eating whales since the 6th century.
Yeah. You have another question that just came up in the chat. How common were whale oil lamps versus camphene in households in the 1830s in the US? I know whale oil was advertised in Dubuque, Iowa in the late 1840s and early 1850s.
I'm going to say far more prevalent. I've not done this exact kind of primary research to figure out, the sale of the lamps or the frequency with which they appear in people's houses. My guess is, due to the volatility of camphene and burning fluids, which may have been a bit more convenient, but could also burn your house down if you weren't careful, that the sperm oil was a pretty popular product.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't.
But that's a whole area of research, that I think would be fascinating to know about. I'd love to know, what was the frequency with which these products wound up in people's houses. I would love to know that. That'd be a great book.
Yeah, I can't tell. Someone has their hand raised on Zoom, and so you're welcome to unmute and ask your question if this.
Hello, have I unmuted successfully?
Yes, you have. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. This is Leah DeLong. What an interesting talk. And it takes a lot of courage for somebody from Massachusetts to talk to a bunch of Iowans about whaling. It was really just wonderful. But you mentioned that steamship that sank, I think maybe in the Missouri River. And I'm sure you know this, but and maybe you said so. But if you go down to Kansas City, there's an entire museum that showcases the products that were found in the excavation of that steamship. So you can, I can't remember if I saw spermaceti candles in that museum or not, but those things are in Kansas City, and you can see them.
Yeah, I've looked at that online, and there are spermaceti candles there. It's one of the, it just blows my mind. I mean, it doesn't really. On the one hand, it blows my mind. On the other hand, it doesn't, because one would assume that these products had a broad distribution, but you never know. I mean, assumption is one thing and knowing is something else. And now you know that there were candles on the way to, some fur trading post in Montana somewhere, which is pretty cool to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And it looks like Leo just added 2 ships, Arabia and Kansas City, Bertrand and Missouri Valley, Iowa.
What was that?
It looks like Leo, who's asked a previous question, added in the names of the 2 ships.
Oh, okay.
One in Kansas City and one in Missouri Valley, Iowa. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions here, but thank you so much for such an informative,
You're welcome.
Interesting presentation. We really appreciate the time, and thank you all for participating, and hopefully you can come and either look at lamps we have here or go see the amazing museum in New Bedford. So.
Yep. You can email me if you choose, if you do have questions about whaling and sperm oil and spermaceti candles and all that stuff. And if there is something that I can help you with, you can, my email is easily accessible on the website, and I'll be happy to talk with you at any time.
Yeah, I'll include that information in my follow-up for this presentation, so that they know where to find information about the Whaling Museum and your information. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we appreciate it very much, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.